Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. In his latest biography, Mark Twain, Ron Chernow brings to life the man known as the father of American literature, the author of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. Chernow digs deep into the personal side of Samuel Clemens, transforming Twain's life into a compelling tale of triumphs, struggles, and big ideas. We learn about the complex, sometimes troubled man behind the humor, a man who faced personal losses, financial disasters, and changing social views, yet somehow remained a giant in American culture. Ron Chernow is the prize-winning author of 7 previous books and the recipient of the 2015 National Humanities Medal. His first book, The House of Morgan, won the National Book Award. Washington, A Life, won the Pulitzer for biography. And Alexander Hamilton, the inspiration for the iconic Broadway musical, won the George Washington Book Prize. The latest is Mark Twain, and it's an absolute pleasure and honor to welcome Ron Chernow to this week's book show. Thank you so much for being with us. What a delight to have you on the program.
Pleasure to be with you.
The thing that is fascinating to me is how many aspects there were to Mark Twain's life. And the fact that these spinning plates, you writing about it is one thing. This guy living it is just another thing that is absolutely incredible. But the fact that you were able to contain all of that, I thought was just beautiful and fascinating.
Thank you. I mean, he was someone who really led 9 lives. You know, he starts out as a printer's devil, then he's a steamboat pilot, then he's a miner, then he's a journalist, then he's a novelist, then he's a lecturer, then he's an investor and then an inventor. It goes on and on and on. So it is difficult to wrap your arms around it. And, most people know Tom Huck, Life on the Mississippi.
Right.
He actually published 2 books in his lifetime. So people tend not to know that he published a novel about Joan of Arc, or wrote a book about Mary Baker Eddy, or wrote a book about Shakespeare, claiming that it was actually Francis Bacon who wrote the plays attributed to Shakespeare. He even wrote a pornographic satire called 1601, set in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. So just in his writing life alone, there was so much more than people know. And his personal life, I think, was arguably more dramatic than any of his novels. And I think that his own persona was arguably more dramatic than any character that he created.
And to point that out, and there's several ways to do that, but one of what you were just talking about in the book of Joan of Arc, you mentioned in the book that he suggests that maybe he needed 2 pen names, that there was Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, and maybe even a third. So when he did a book like Joan of Arc, people weren't looking for another Huck Finn.
Exactly, so that he became known as America's most beloved humorist. He said it was something of a problem because when he got up to speak, people would be on the verge of laughter before he even opened his mouth. And late in life, he made the statement. He said that he was expected to simply be bubbling with humor all the time. And he was a man of many moods, a very erudite, kind of very wide-ranging interests. And increasingly throughout his life, he wanted to deal with more serious subjects. And what happened when he published the novel about Joan of Arc, he did not put his name on the title page because he was afraid it's not a particularly funny book. There's some sly, funny asides to the book, but it's definitely not a comic book. And he was very proud of all the research that went into it. But he was very afraid that if he put his name on the cover, that people would be expecting to laugh and that they would then feel cheated by it. So you're absolutely right that he was sorry that early in his career, he had not adopted 2 pen names, one for the humor books, one for the more serious books, which would then have given him three names to juggle.
which worked for him when he was introducing himself, you read about too, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's funny because the pen name, of course, was Mark Twain. He got that from his steamboat days. It meant 2 fathoms or 12 feet deep. When the leadsman would drop the anchor over the side on the steamboat, if it was 12 feet, he would call back to the pilot, Mark Twain, Mark Twain. And it's really a rather perfect name. And I didn't know as I was doing the book, I didn't realize to the extent to which he became the pen name. That is, he would sign letters to many friends, Mark, and they would address him as Mark. With his wife and daughters, it was always, Samuel or something more personal.
How difficult is it for you as a biographer to write about someone who contradicts himself at many, many, many turns? I love you, and then 5 weeks later, I hate you.
Yeah, he was somebody who tended to fall in love with people, and then, once he was disillusioned with them, he would turn on them with a vengeance and often engage in vendettas. And one of the things that I find very characteristic of Mark Twain is that when he was wounded, the wound wouldn't heal. I think that with most of us, we've all had the experience many times in life of being disappointed and angry with people, and we finally blow up and we get it off our chest and we move on. We either kind of make up or, we move on from the relationship. Whereas Mark Twain would keep licking the wound for weeks or months or sometimes years. So that, for instance, when he was starting out as a journalist in San Francisco, Bret Hart was the most celebrated young writer of the day, not Mark Twain. And then there was a role reversal because Mark Twain kept getting richer and more famous, and Bret Hart's fortunes kept falling lower and lower. And finally, they had a blow up. And, Mark Twain's tirades against him were just titanic. He said that Bret Hart never had an idea that he came by honestly. He said that Bret Hart was a man without a country. No, that's too strong a term. He was an invertebrate without a country. And he was so the master of the put down that once he started on you, heaven help you. But I was never able to figure out why he was like that. And I spent a lot of time in the book talking about, his marriage to Livy Langdon. Livy was a very prim and proper woman of exquisite taste. In fact, what happened with Bret Hart was that she said to her husband to go easy on Bret Hart. And she said, don't you realize he's had so much misfortune and we've been so lucky? Can't you have it in your heart to be a little kinder to him? And she had to train him in what we would call anger management, so that she trained him when he wrote a very angry, impetuous letter, instead of sending it right away, to stuff it in the drawer and write a cooler one. And his letters are stuffed with morning after a dinner party with Mark Twain writing to someone. The madam tells me I might have been a little sharp and brusque with you last night. And if I did so, I apologize. He didn't have that kind of social awareness. And so she really kind of made him presentable in polite society. She had to train him. And so she developed a dinner party. She had a system of color-coded cards. If she held up a red card, it meant to him, are you going to monopolize the woman on your right all night? If she held up a blue card, it meant, are you going to sit there and say nothing all night? And the daughters found this hugely amusing. They called it mother dusting off father. And Twain once said very accurately, Livy edited my manuscripts and then edited me. And he admitted that when he first met her, he was a mighty rough, coarse, uncompromising character. He was from this, backwater on the Mississippi, and she'd grown up in this very aristocratic atmosphere as the daughter of a very rich man in upstate New York.
He
Yeah,
had such an amazing relationship with his mother. The letters that he would write to his
yeah.
mother, where he would
Yeah.
bare his soul, he would share almost everything with her about his feelings and personal concerns and worries. We certainly know much more about his relationship with his mother than with his father, and you wonder what impact that had on him.
Well, as a biographer, you always look for the silences because the important things are not the things the person wants to talk about, but the things they want to avoid. And Mark Twain, who was so chatty on every subject, only said two or three things about his father. His father was a cold and distant man. He said we were on the most distant terms, a sort of armed neutrality, a rather chilling term. Another time he said my knowledge of my father amounted to little more than an introduction. And he clearly feared his father. It's interesting, this father who found humor in nothing spawned this son who seemed to find humor in everything. And I think that the fact that he had this fearsome father, the humor was kind of a defense. It was a way of, I'm sure, deflecting. It also left him, and this is very important for his fiction, left him with a suspicion of authority figures and institutions. And then there was the mother, the wonderful Jane Lambton Clemens, who was funny and spirited, and she loved to wear the color red. She loved any kind of spectacle, whether it was a circus or a funeral. And she had an almost comical resemblance to him. She had the exact same slow drawl that Mark Twain had. And she had a humor that was very reminiscent of his. In fact, Mark Twain was a premature child. And in later years, he was talking with his mother, and he said to his mother that when he was a baby, he was so sickly. He said to his mother, "You must have been worried about me all the time." And she agreed. She said, "Oh, yeah, all the time." And then he persisted and said, "You must have been afraid that I wouldn't make it." And then with his deadpan, absolutely worthy of her son, she says, "Oh no, I was afraid you would." And it's such a Mark Twain line. As soon as you see it, you kind of see where he got it, that kind of pause, then the unexpected spin and sticking in the knife. I mean, it's an exact description, of a Mark Twain line. And so he said that she was one of the purest and finest characters that America had created. And so I think that it started a pattern where he would get kind of his emotional nourishment from women. His father had failed at 4 or 5 different businesses, and this left Mark Twain with a lifelong dread of poverty. You were talking about his contradictions. I mean, arguably the most glaring contradiction is here is the man who more than anyone else satirized the excesses of the Gilded Age. In fact, he coined the term Gilded Age, was the title of his first novel. So here he is satirizing the plutocrats. So you would get the feeling, oh, Mark Twain couldn't be interested in making money. But in fact, when he wasn't satirizing the plutocrats, he was doing everything in his power to become one, and poured millions and millions of dollars into failed business trying to become a tycoon. So in many ways, he was one of the money mad characters that he so brilliantly satirized. They were kind of more autobiographical portraits than I had realized before.
And you talk about losing a fortune, but he actually lost fortunes. So there was the publishing fortune that he lost. He lost his wife's fortune.
Yeah.
She of course was a from a very moneyed family, and he loses that, and then of course on all of these businesses, as well as problems even with the lecture circuit that he was so known for at the time.
Well, you put your finger on an important part of the story because, he makes a fortune from his book royalties, from his lecture fees, and then from having married an heiress. And he manages to squander all of that. Now, he and Libby were living in Hartford. They were living in a 25-room house, 11,500 square feet. They had 6 loyal servants. Mark Twain could have had an easy, placid life. He was making a lot of money. He had married into a lot of money. And so these are self-inflicted wounds. He was not able to resist this urge to speculate. He said, I have a speculative nature. He once made the statement, I've always been the easy prey of the cheap adventurer. He would fall in love with these inventors, particularly a man named James W. Page, who came up with a mechanical compositor that Twain thought was going to revolutionize the newspaper business. And the concept was good. It was this exquisitely complicated machine with 18,000 square parts. And you can see Mark Twain in his notebook. He's adding up long columns of the number of newspapers, both here and abroad, that would be forced to buy the Page machine or to rent the Page machine. And he comes up with numbers that show that he's going to become, as he puts it, one of the Vanderbilt gang, one of the richest men in the world. But then what happens? The Page machine lost out in this race to a machine that a man named Mergenthaler created, the linotype that then became the industry standard. And Twain became so angry at James W. Page, he said that if Page were drowning, I would throw him an anvil. His wrath was bottomless when he was disillusioned with people. In fact, someone wrote to him and asked if he could send him a book about inventors. And Twain writes back to the person and says, if it's a book about how to exterminate inventors, please send it to me. In fact, send it express.
Ron Chernow is our guest. The name of the new book is Mark Twain. When it comes to the lecture circuit, I grew up the son of a librarian. I grew up reading Twain, but then there was a moment where I saw Hal Holbrook do Mark Twain Tonight. Was that a fairly good representation of what a night was like in a theater with Mark Twain?
It's a great, great question. I really should have dedicated this book to Hal Holbrook because my interest in Mark Twain, even though I'm an old English major, really started with seeing Hal Holbrook when I was 24 years old. I was a freelance magazine writer struggling in Philadelphia. And I saw these posters up from Mark Twain Tonight, exclamation point, Hal Holbrook. And I went in and there was Holbrook in the trademark white suit and the cigar and the unruly mustache. And he came up with one political witticism after another that had me howling with laughter. He said, "There's no Native American criminal class except the Congress." He said, "Suppose you're an idiot and suppose you're a congressman, but I repeat myself." And he said, I say it with pride that we have legislatures that command higher prices than any other in the world. Well, I was not only howling with laughter, but I was thinking to myself how amazing it was that humor, which is usually very fleeting, very transient, that these were still fresh and funny and pertinent 100, 150 years later. I think that it was a very good representation of Mark Twain on the stage. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a recording of his voice. We have like 2 minutes of footage of him from the last 2 years of his life, but we don't have any footage of him, on stage. We have a lot of descriptions from different reporters and different people who saw him. Sometimes he would stand up there and really not move. He would just be talking. It was purely the power of his words. He also became an absolute master at the promotion of these lectures. From his very earliest lectures, he created these posters that said, "Doors open at 7 o'clock, the troubles begin at 8." And then he would vary it and he would say the orgies commence at 8, or he would say the insurrection will start at 8, or the wisdom will flow at 8. And my favorite one, he would say in some of the posters, he promised that he would devour a child in the presence of the audience if some lady will kindly volunteer an infant for the occasion. He was a showman. He was a master of self-promotion, and so he became the original celebrity. And what I mean by that is this first time that there was somebody who became this instantly recognizable author. First time the white suit appeared, it was actually like 4 years before he died, and the reporters were startled, and they said, "What is this white suit about in the middle of the winter?" And he said, "It's the uniform of the American Association of Purity and Perfection, of which I am the president and the sole member." He called it his "I don't give a damn" suit. He became more and more outrageous the older he got. And he would often wear it with raspberry colored socks or lavender socks or
Hmm.
lime socks. So he really wanted to look eccentric. He would often give interviews in his nightshirt sitting in bed. And a kind of Groucho Marx ability to impress his image and his humor on the public.
You introduce us to these ideas at the very beginning of the book in the preface of telling us that the two subjects that are going to land oddly here are one, race and
Right.
his thoughts on race,
Yeah.
and the other is his relationship with young girls, which he refers to as angelfish. And I'm assuming you felt that was as odd writing as I did reading it.
Yeah, well, in terms of race, that in a way was a pleasure to write about because he grows up in a slave-owning family. His adolescent letters are full of crude racist jibes. And then he grows into really one of the most tolerant and broad-minded white authors of the late 19th century. I mean, for instance, he says that American liberty should be dated not to 1776, but to 1865 when slavery was abolished. I mean, that was an absolute pleasure to chart that change because it's a very positive change. The angelfish is very disturbing to write about it. As a dutiful biographer, I have to follow where the facts led. And what the story was, he was very happily married. and very faithful to his wife throughout the marriage. She dies in 1904. Then strange things start to happen. In 1905, he still is lecturing, but he announces that he's only going to lecture at women's colleges. He said, I seem to have the college girl habit. But then it gets worse because the year after that, he starts to collect, and that's his verb, not mine. He starts to collect teenage girls between the age of 11 and 16. He calls them his angelfish. They become members of his aquarium club. He's the only male member of the aquarium club. He's the admiral of the club, as he calls it. And he has a special room in his house. And he decides that there's always going to be an angelfish on the premises. In his later years, about half his correspondence is with these girls. Now, I have to be very sort of careful in defining what this was like. There were never any accusations whatsoever of Twain groping the girls or any kind of inappropriate sexual behavior. In fact, he would incorporate the girls' mothers and grandmothers into this. There was nothing furtive or secretive about it. He loved nothing more with the photographers than posing with the girls. And the girls had very happy memories. One of the girls, Dorothy Quick, later wrote a very adoring memoir called Enchantment. So having said all these things, people at the time thought that this was yet another endearing eccentricity of, Mark Twain. We read it, and I'm sure every single person who reads this book is going to find it very disturbing and very unsettling, even though it was chaste, there was no sexual predation that was part of it. His two surviving daughters were very uncomfortable to
I
see.
thought that was telling.
It was telling. They knew that there was something wrong. And I think kind of what really for me gave the game away was that there was an obsessive quality about this. He had a secretary named Isabel Lyon, who was his constant companion in his last years. Now, Isabel was in her early 40s. She was very often escorting the girls back and forth. She was constantly there when the girls were there. But she describes, like Twain was constantly begging the girls to come for days, even weeks at a time. And he said when the girls were about to arrive, Twain would be at the door nervously pacing and looking at his watch, and where she is. It was like much too important. There was much too much energy about this. And of course, both the girls and their families were immensely flattered. The most famous writer in the world suddenly, thought my Dorothy is this young
Right.
Genius. And in fact, kind of give you a sense of how it was regarded then versus now.
You mentioned in the book, and this goes back to race and specifically Huck Finn, you quote Percival Everett, who
Right.
of course is the Pulitzer Prize winning author of the book James.
Yeah, there were always two controversies about Huck Finn. One, most famously, the N-word. The N-word appears 200 times in the book. To state what I hope is obvious, Twain is using the N-word not to endorse racism, but to expose the racism that is pervading these characters. But I can certainly understand, how with contemporary readers this causes extreme discomfort. And it's unfortunate because somehow is associated in the public mind Mark Twain with racism, where he was really it was the greatest anti-slavery, novel that we have, and he was the opposite of a racist. The other controversy about the book, going back, I'd say 60, 70 years, critics examining the portrait of Jim
Right.
in Huck Finn found what they referred to as minstrel affectations. So that's, I think, a fair criticism. One also has to note that Jim is far and away the most sensitive and noble and dignified character in the book, almost the only sensitive, noble, and dignified character in the book that's full of whites who are violent and crude. And so I think Percival Everett, I like to think of his book as not so much a debunking of Twain as a kind of a corrective or a compliment to Twain in the sense that he felt, and I don't know him, I know this from interviews he's given, that he felt that Mark Twain, as a white man in the late 19th century, was equipped to do a kind of fully realized portrait of Huck as a young white boy. but that there were limitations to how far he could project himself into the reality of a black man escaping from slavery. So I very much, admire the book.
And Everett does in the portrayal of Jim, the affectation is something that he only does in front of white people.
That's right. That there's this kind of like slave patter
Yes,
that he uses, and that's basically,
almost a
to keep
character.
the white man at a distance and to fool the whites. And so it's an affectation that is used as a mechanism of survival.
I don't usually, when I'm preparing for interviews, I don't like to read reviews until after I've read the book fully, which is what I did in this case. My God, the New York Times review made me mad. How'd you take it?
Well, there's an old Arab proverb: the dogs may bark, but the caravan moves on.
Yeah.
I think you can imagine how I reacted.
If you don't want to talk about this, I understand, but it does seem like there was a vendetta there. Like there was some sort of score they were looking to settle.
Yeah, I can't speculate. I think that this is such a ambitious and scrupulously researched a book that is far and away the most comprehensive portrait of
Yeah.
Mark Twain ever published, that adds so many new dimensions, to his story, that I would think that any good reviewer would have recognized just how much new material there is, how this changes our perspective.
The way that you took this huge, larger than life character and were able to look at all of these aspects so beautifully and so intimately and so completely, I just thought was great art and an amazing biography, as your work always is.
Needless to say, I greatly appreciate your appreciation.
Ron Chernow, I thank you very much for spending time with us. It's an absolute delight, and I wish you the best. Thank you so much for being here.
This has been a pure delight for me. I really appreciate it. And I love your close reading of the book.
Ron Chernow's latest biography is Mark Twain. It is published by Penguin Press. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks